So with us is Dr. Dave Franzen. Dave is a professor at NDSU, and he's our extension soil specialist. So we're very pleased that Dave can join us, and he's going to have a concise period to talk about a lot of stuff in soil management and in particular plant nutrition with dry beans.
So I'm going to share some soil fertility things that you should consider as a grower or people that that work with you. So we have a circular. It's relatively up to date, fertilizing Pinals. So refer to that with some of this basic material that I'll be sharing you today. So first of all, the nitrogen nutrition of dry bean is pretty odd. You can inoculate it with rhizobium, but it has been showed already the effect is very inconsistent. One of the problems is that even if you get nodules, they may not stick around for the whole season because the dry bean will slough them off if the soil is too wet, it's too dry, too hot, too cold, if you have soil salt. So it's kind of iffy. So it depends on how your field has responded really in the past. So we have three recommendations. One is that you don't do anything at all. And I've seen fields like this where people haven't inoculated for 20 years, but they've had dry beans in a rotation for 30 years, and the soils are wonderful, and they don't have wet spots, and it's not too droughty, and the roots are just covered with nodules, and they don't need any nitrogen, and they don't need to be inoculated. So that's number one. Number two is that your field is uniform enough and doesn't have enough issues that you can get by with rhizobium, and that's number two. And then number three is you don't trust the rhizobium, and you just go ahead and put some nitrogen fertilizer on, and the recommended rate is around 70 pounds of N. I know people that go higher than that, and they're fine, but you can see this response curve is very shallow. So with nitrogen prices 50% at least higher than what they were last year, not surprised to see your N cost being above 50 cents a pound of N. You might consider what to do. All right, so I didn't mention nitrogen fertilizer in inoculation, and this is why. This is from some data from our friends to the north, and in each case when they had a certain variety, they inoculated, but the nodulation goes down with N rate. Here's the N rate down here from 0 to 140, and it just collapses when you put nitrogen on. So putting on both really doesn't make a whole lot of sense. You either do one or the other. And their response curve are very similar to what ours are. You know, they're very flat. I mean, they don't start down here and then go up here. They start up high and then they get a little bit higher. So that goes into consideration of how profitable a real high N rate will be, particularly this year. All right. So do nothing, inoculate, and fertilize up to 70 pounds of N. You're not going to go to production heck if you decide to go higher than that, but there's not a huge reason to. So what about phosphate? Greg mentioned that phosphate and zinc are the two nutrients that you most have to consider, and that's true. You get most of our responses with those once you have your nitrogen in place, but it's not a huge responder. The phosphate also, if you were to broadcast, which isn't a great idea this year since phosphate prices are double what they were last year, if you did do that, the chances of huge economic responses are pretty limited. All right, so this is a lot of this data is from Greg Indra, so I really appreciate him sharing with me his results, and really I really want to thank him for doing the work, because it's moved us ahead in the production quite a little bit. So they've done a lot of phosphate research. So this is the average of 7 trials, and they compared untreated, which means no in-furrow starter fertilizer, no phosphate fertilizer at all, and then compared to in-furrow with 2 to 3 gallon of 1034O, and you can see a nice little bump there of around what, 3 bushel or 300 hundredweight per acre. and that certainly would pay for things even this year. So far this year, 1034.0 hasn't taken the giant leap that MAP or DAP has. If your suppliers will allow you to line up your 1034.0 ahead of time or take it in, I think sooner is better than later. I wouldn't be surprised that once we get closer to the spring that the 1034.0 price also rocketed, but so far that hasn't happened to my knowledge. So just a word of the wise. All right, so a lot of the 1034 is diluted, and some people believe that the dilution helps the safety of it to the beans, and the work that Greg has done has shown that that's really not that big of a deal. In practical terms, though, I like to see the 1034.0, especially if you're going to use it at 2-3 gallon an acre, diluted a little bit, because 1034.0 is just so viscous and thick, as you know. And if you're moving across the field at, I don't know, 6-8 miles per hour or something like that, planting, and only putting on 3 gallon an acre, you might be just glugging out every other plant. And so if you dilute it, it just means that you get a more even application of the liquid across, and that's why I would consider diluting it. Doesn't take much, you know, a gallon or two of water, just enough so that it's not nearly as sticky and viscous in your hand as the original product was. This is some work that compared the in-furrow and band applied. The band applied means it's separating with separated from the seed as opposed to in-furrow, and there's no significant difference between those. Those numbers are the same, and we still have the increase in yield. So in-furrow is a lot easier to do than putting it off to the side. If you're already set off to put it off to the side, fine, but it doesn't have to be. So you can just put the tube down right with the seed, and you should be okay as long as you keep those rates low. And this is the yield between broadcast and furrow band applied, and broadcast really isn't a great performer. And certainly this year with the MAP and DAP price so darn high, I think you're economically hugely in your favor if you consider just doing the band and letting it go. And then mid-row band, it's nitrogen is okay for a mid-row band, but with phosphate, it just doesn't move. So the roots have to move to it, or the mycorrhiza have to move to it. And so the benefits of mid-row band with phosphate have always been very low compared to other application techniques. And this is high rates versus low rates, and 2.5 to 3 gallon an acre on the left compared to 5 to 6 gallon on the right, and there's no difference between it. So again, just use a low rate. That's the greatest return you're going to get, and save you money and deal with the phosphate later when your soil test comes in. So Greg put together this nice circular on pinal bean response, and you can find it easily. I've even put it on my webpage under my extension publications. So you should be able to access it, and it has a lot of this information in it if you need support to talk to your brother, father, sister, mother, whoever. So we'll move on to potassium. It's not a great responder to the potassium. If the soil test is greater than 80 ppm, you're okay. Soil tests that are below that, applying some potassium is probably a good idea. You're not going to find K-tests that low unless you're on a, say, an Arvilla soil that's really eroded and really sandy, very deep. So as long as you're zone testing your fields, you should be able to identify these areas and work your way through it. And this isn't put with the seed. This is a broadcast. So then zinc and sulfur, Greg and his associates at Carrington have also worked with this. And so are there any advantages of any of the specialty fertilizers or foliar fertilizer of any of this kind of thing? One of the things to keep in mind is where the zinc is in our soils. Our zinc soil tests, for the most part, in depressional areas tend to be on the high side, on the near the 1.0 ppm, which is generally the line where we say Above that, you wouldn't expect to see much of a response, and below that, you're more and more likely to do that. In the dry bean producing areas historically, and corn producing areas in the state, these are already kind of on the high side. But in individual fields, that of course will vary a lot. So, and then sulfur was tested also. Sulfur input into our soils have changed greatly in the last 20 years. This is the map of the United States, at least continental United States in 2000. You can see the coal plant in Saskatchewan across the border from Crosby up here with the plume, the yellow thing. And then our coal fire plants that we may or may not have here along the river. And we see them also in 2019, but the amount of sulfur that's emitting from those is greatly reduced, as is the sulfur that's coming down from the atmosphere generally across the state. So in wet years, we tend to have a problem in many crops, especially corn and small grains, and to a lesser extent, other crops. We don't have any firm sulfur recommendations for dry beans. The soil test is garbage, so don't even bother. The soil sulfur responses are mostly weather and soil related, and that would particularly be the case with dry beans. So far, since from the fall, well, really from late summer all the way through fall, so far this year, it's been on the dry side. So if I was going to bet and to see if nothing happened from now on, if we'd have a lot of sulfur responses, I would say maybe not, but you never know. If you decide to do it, of course, the broadcast or separating it with the seed is the best option. Don't use elemental sulfur. It's not quite garbage, but it doesn't do what you think it's going to do. Never put ammonium thiosulfate, that's a liquid sulfur source, with the seed. Just no, don't do that. So how about in-furrow zinc? Greg has been very disappointed with the kind of results he's been able to obtain from his zinc research. He starts out with zinc soil tests that you would think have a chance of response, and he just hasn't seen too much. That doesn't bother me a whole lot because zinc is pretty cheap. And across the landscape, you get areas that are eroded and don't have as much organic matter. And in a field situation, you're likely to see a response at that point. So it's not that great of expense that, or if you're putting a pint or a quart of some kind of a chelate or some kind of a liquid zinc on it, it's really going to be a big economic drag to you. So even though he hasn't seen a whole lot of response to this, if I were a grower, I'd still do it for the just in case thing. This is foliar zinc. Again, no significant differences. I mean, you're tempted to kind of look and see, well, there's a bushel there, but it's really not a bushel there. It's if the stats tell you there's no difference, then believe it, because there's a lot of variability in the data. And this is foliar sulfur. In 1 year, in 2019, there was a nice response. And in the other years, there really wasn't. 2019 was a fairly wet year, and Carrington with almost 12 inches of rain during the growing season from mid-May till the peak growing year of the dry beans. So that's probably why they saw the difference here. And this is foliar again, and again in 2019 they had a nice increase, and the other years they really didn't. So Carrington's been on the front line with all of this material. They've tested private label type of zinc products, specialty type products. None of them seem to perform any better than our 1034O based experiments. They continue the work here into 2020 and probably beyond. And then finally, Hans has already showed you this, but you really need to keep this in mind. If the dry bean price is up, it's really common for people to just try to throw them in anywhere they can, without really regard of what their soil's been doing. Especially then, since last year was kind of dry, the salt levels of these fields are going to be a little bit higher going into the spring than they have been. So just watch your field selection really well. And if a field's not adapted to it, for goodness sakes, don't do that.